So to introduce myself, my name is Dr. Emanuelle Degli Esposti. I recently completed my PhD at SOAS, which is the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. And now I've just started a postdoctoral appointment at the University of Cambridge, as was said, at the Centre of Islamic Studies. So the seminar today it's sort of a little bit of a hybrid. So I'm partly presenting some of the findings from my PhD, partly going to talk about my current and ongoing research project for the next 3 years, which is obviously at the Centre of Islamic Studies, and also wanted to open the forum at the end for more of an informal discussion about some of the issues that have been raised and whether on, basically to get feedback and ideas for things that I could do in the future and research going forward. So, to just a very kind of overview of, I was speaking to some lovely people at lunch, and I mentioned the title of my topic, and the first thing they said is, "What is a Shia?" So, I think I should probably start with a very general overview of. Within Islam, there are several different schools, just as in Christianity there are several different schools. You know, you've got Anglicanism, you've got Protestantism, you've got Baptism, you've got Mormonism, and all these others. In Islam, there are arguably two major schools, of which 80% of the Muslims in the world, 80 to 85% of the Muslims in the world are Sunni, and about 12 to 15% of the Muslims in the world are the smaller denomination, which are known as Shia. The name Shia comes from the Arabic for Shiat Ali, which means the followers of Ali. And this dates back to the split between Islam, or between the Sunni and the Shia, which happened around the time of the death of the Prophet Muhammad. And it was a split over succession in terms of who the Muslim community should follow as their leader to continue the teachings of Muhammad and to continue the tradition of Islam. And so the majority of the population, the Sunnah, followed one scholar, one particular man, and the Shia, the minority, followed the Prophet's son-in-law, Ali. So they were the Shiat Ali, the followers of Ali, now commonly known as the Shia. Fast forward several hundred years, and the split between Sunni and Shia on a day-to-day level doesn't make much of a difference in terms of the practice of Islam. You know, the tenets of the faith are ultimately the same, but there are some sort of political issues in terms of the history of the succession. There was some violence, there was some fighting. The Shia had an uprising which was brutally suppressed, and even to this day, because they're the minority, they tend to be persecuted by Sunni Muslims in Sunni countries and elsewhere. So, for example, ISIS, Daesh in Iraq have been killing a lot of Shia. The Saudi government have had quite a brutal campaign repressing Shias. In Bahrain, the uprising was predominantly a Shia uprising that was again suppressed by the Sunni regime. So there's all these sort of political and social factors that play into this ultimately theological divide. But at the end of the day, they're both Muslim, and Islam is the tenets of the faith are the same. So hopefully that's a bit of a background. So what do I mean by being Shia in Europe? So against all of that background, and if you consider the fact that, as I said, 80% to 85% of the Muslims in the world are Sunni, and that translates to the Muslim populations in Europe, especially in Britain. You know, the majority of Muslims in Britain are Sunni. If you are from a minority branch of Islam, how do you fit in within wider British society, which, you know, there's a growing sense of Islamophobia, there is a widespread denigration of Muslims. If you look in any newspaper, you know, Muslim is equated with terrorists, and Muslim and extremists, and Muslim and radicalism. There are pejorative images of women in hijabs, pejorative reporting of women wearing niqabs, etc., etc. But if you don't identify with the form of Islam that is being denigrated, if you are follow a different kind of Islam, how do you fit in within the Muslim community in Europe, and how do you fit in with the wider population in Europe? So those are the central questions that I'm investigating in this research. And this picture, I feel, encapsulates some of the themes that I'm trying to draw out. So this is a picture of it was taken during the Muharram Ashura March. So every year, Shia Muslims commemorate the death of Imam Ali, who was the son, Imam Hussein, sorry, who was the son of Imam Ali, the original follower of the Prophet Muhammad that they followed. Hussein was killed with his family after he tried to organize a rebellion against the Sunni caliphs of the time. So every year for the first 10 days of the Islamic month of Muharram, Shia Muslims venerate and commemorate the death of Imam Hussein, sorry. And this picture was taken in 2014. So this was also the time in which ISIS had just taken over Mosul in Iraq. So there was lots of tension within the community in terms of the violence that had been perpetrated against Shias in Iraq. And this was a prayer that was held in Marble Arch in London, so in a very public forum, so partly to obviously commemorate the death of Imam Hussein, and then also partly to try to show a different side of Islam. So there were, I mean, there's not a picture of this, but there were people holding posters saying, "Down with ISIS, ISIS are terrorists, you know, Shia Muslims are the biggest victims of terrorists," and all of these different things as a way to show the wider British public, who obviously would see this because it's on the street, that we're not that kind of Muslim. You know, we're not those bad Muslims who are off killing people, but we are being peaceful, we are praying, we are commemorating someone's death, and we're just going about our business. So, tried to have a swish presentation, and it might all collapse. So, to basic overview of the contemporary context. As I said, increased public scrutiny of Muslims in Europe, especially post-2011, 2001, 9/11, the increasing securitization of Islam, the prevent, there's lots of reporting in the media in terms of what prevent means for Muslim communities, the fact that they feel under threat, under siege, ongoing sectarian violence and political instability in the Middle East. We've got the conflicts in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, etc., etc. All of these play into the relations between Muslims in Europe and within the UK, many of whom come from these countries or have family in those countries or have links to those countries for other reasons. Obviously, the terror attacks on European soil, we have several in Paris, London, Manchester, Berlin, Nice, etc., etc., all of which obviously fuels the Islamophobia and the denigration of Muslims more widely. And as part of this, or rather separate to this, but I would like to say also slightly almost dovetails with it slightly, is the rise of transnational movements and international activism, especially movements such as the Me Too protests, the Occupy movement, Je suis Charlie, Black Lives Matter. All of these more transnational themes, movements centered around the themes of justice, equality, fighting against oppression, which I would like to argue is something that Shia Muslims are also doing within the European context to try and bring out some of the themes of their faith and show that they don't necessarily fall within the same category as those who are doing the terror attacks, for example. So, Shiaism in Europe, often called a minority within a minority by Shia Muslims and academics alike. Who like to come up with phrases like that. So roughly, there's no accurate figures because we don't take census data of religious sect in the UK or even, I believe, in any European country. But the estimate is that they make up to between 10 and 15% of the population in Europe. They're historically neglected, especially in what I mean by that is within academia. So they're at least until the last perhaps 10 years, there was little or no scholarship on Shiaism, except some eccentric women and men who travelled to Iran back in the 1970s and used to go and do ethnographic accounts of Shia rituals in Iran. But beyond that, there was very little information or very little academic scholarship that was done specifically on Shia Muslims. This is starting to change. There are increasing numbers of scholars who are becoming interested, especially, I think, as a result of the increasing politicization of sectarian conflicts in the Middle East. People have sort of sat up and said, oh, hang on a second, you know, these guys are fighting each other, and they're saying, so we need to understand what they're fighting about and if that's relevant to us. Again, the current literature tends to focus on Shia religious theology and religious practice, issues of gender migration, not so much focus on networks, activism, and the way in which they engage with wider society, especially I'm talking here about the diasporic context. So when it comes to Shia Muslims in Europe, how do they engage with non-Shias? How do they engage with Sunnis? How do they engage with Christians or Jews within the context of Britain and Europe? And this is just a quote I have from one of my interview participants, she says, "The Shia are all silent. You always hear about Muslims, but they're inevitably South Asian and Sunni. You never hear about Shiis. We don't have a voice. We need to show people that it's not us that do all these crazy things." These crazy things being terrorism, ISIS, the attacks in Westminster, etc., etc. So, this is partly based on my fieldwork that was conducted in London in the UK. So this is more of a presentation of some of the findings I made. Again, no accurate figures, but around 15% of estimated Muslims, 2.7 million Muslims in the UK. The demographic mix of Shias tends to be slightly different from those of Sunnis. So Sunni Muslims in the UK are predominantly from India and Pakistan. Shia Muslims, while there are large numbers of Indo-Pakistanis, they're not as visible. So in terms of institutional visibility and those who are most engaged in the kind of Shia public life, as it were, in the UK, tend to come from either Arab or Iranian backgrounds, with also some East African Indians, or Indo-Pakistanis from East Africa, known as Khojas. Which obviously contrasts quite differently from the South Asian population of Sunni Muslims. There's also a slight class difference when it comes to Sunni and Shia Muslims in the UK. In the Sunni Muslims, as you may not have seen in the press, there's this sort of perpetuating stereotype of the Pakistani man who grows up in the UK but then goes over back to Pakistan to marry a Pakistani woman and bring his young bride back who doesn't speak English. So there is a tendency in the kind of Sunni Muslim Pakistani communities to have increased or a continuous first generation. And they tend to come from poor villages, they tend to be economic migrants, whereas a lot of the Shia Muslims came over predominantly in the 70s and 80s. They were often political refugees fleeing from places such as Iraq, Iran, Bahrain, Kuwait, and they tended to be more middle class. They tend to be more educated. So there's also that division between the two sects in the kind of British context, in terms of why they might not necessarily relate to each other in the same way, or not necessarily relate to the image of Islam that's being portrayed in the British media. You know, if you are an Iraqi who went to university and studied pharmacology and is now working as a pharmacist, and you see all these media representations of the Pakistani villager, that means nothing to you. You know, you're completely removed from that. So yes, and then one of the findings that of my fieldwork, of my PhD fieldwork, that especially among the younger generation, so of those Shia Muslims who were born and brought up in the UK, there is this emergence of what I call a British Shia identity. So this is counter to the previous literatures on the British Muslim identity, but saying that this British Muslim identity is also sort of bifurcated into a British Shia and a British Sunni identity. And the Shia identity also transcends ethnic boundaries. So, I mean, anecdotally, for example, there are now more intermarriages among second or third generation Shias from different ethnic backgrounds, which would have been unheard of even 20 years ago. I went to one wedding, which was a second generation Iraqi girl who was an Alawiyya, so therefore a direct descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, who married a third generation Pakistani man who was not a Sayyid, so not descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. 20 years ago, wouldn't have happened, because she would have, you know, as an Iraqi woman from a descendant from the Prophet Muhammad, you'd be a higher, almost higher social and cultural capital than a Pakistani man, and that kind of union would be unheard of. Now, when you're getting to the second, third generation, what holds these people together is that their common religious faith and their common beliefs in a society in which there is a higher plurality of faiths, beliefs, etc. So, this is a little map showing some of the main Shia institutions in London. as you can see, they're all clustered, mostly clustered in this corner of northwest London, within the borough of Brent. And it's often known as either Najaf in Brent, Najaf being a reference to the Shia, the holy shrine city in southern Iraq, which is holy to Shia Muslims, or also known as the Shia Triangle, hence the triangle. So yes, so that's a kind of mapping exercise. And just to contextualize, the largest number of Sunni Muslims in London tend to be in East London, so around Tower Hamlets, White City's West London, Tower Hamlets, Mile End, etc. So there's also a spatial separation as well as a demographic, theological, etc. And then these are some really interesting campaigns that were run by, or continue to be run actually, by Shia Muslims. This one up here, I don't know if you can read it, it says, "Is today your day?" And there's a bit of a quote there from the Hadith, I think, talking about the life of Imam Hussein, who, as I said, was the son of Imam Ali, who was killed on the battlefield by the Sunni Caliphate after he tried to organize a rebellion to overthrow the son of Sunni, the Sunni overlords. This is a campaign called Who is Hussein, and they've been running now for, I think, since 2011, and they now run across 27 different countries. And they are trying to promote the figure of Hussein as an emancipatory figure, above and beyond Islam, but also just to non-Muslims as a figure to be venerated, and as somebody who stood up for justice, who stood up against oppression, and who is an example to follow. Again, so this on the right-hand side is a flyer that was handed out at one of the Ashura processions in central London. Again, you have the figure of Hussein, and he's being compared to people such as Moses, Buddha, Jesus Christ, Che Guevara, Gandhi, Plato, quite a diverse group of people there. But the theme is the same. The theme is very much, these are figures who stood up for justice, these are figures who believe in equality, these are historical figures that we should all look to try and emulate in our own lives. And then at the bottom here, you've got the Imam Hussein blood donation campaign, which is actually running in partnership with the NHS. So this is really interesting because one of the more controversial practices, and there's a lot of controversy even within Shiaism about this, is the act of, you may have seen in the media especially, it's often reported quite negatively, this practice of cutting oneself or self-flagellation during the commemoration of the death of Imam Hussein. It's frowned upon in most mainstream Shia circles, but there are still some small segments of the sect who practice it. However, this campaign was set up as a way of trying to bring that philosophy. So the idea behind it is obviously because you're suffering for the suffering of Hussein. So you're trying to kind of relieve yourself in a cathartic way of the pain that you experience in reliving the death of Hussein. So the Imam Hussein blood donation campaign taps into that grief and that sorrow, but uses it obviously for a good cause in terms of don't cut yourself, give blood. It's some people find it a little bit controversial because obviously there is a lot of debate within Shiism about this, but the fact is that it's almost moving it towards a more modern interpretation of how you can be true to your faith, if that's what you believe, and yet contribute to wider society. And then this here is a logo of the Ahl Bayt societies, which are university societies that were set up for Shia Muslims and that run events, lots of outreach campaigns, etc., etc. So now this is now moving on to my my postdoc project. So my postdoctoral project, I'm taking the data from my PhD, but I'm also wanting to now look at just beyond the UK, but also look at Shia Muslims in other European countries. So the two sites that I have identified as potential sites of interest are Scandinavia and Belgium, and I'll go into why in a minute. So Scandinavia, Why Scandinavia? Partly because they're societies with progressive immigration and integration policies. So if you're looking at Shia Muslims within the framework of Muslims in Europe as an integration immigration issue, then Scandinavia emerges as an interesting case study, especially because in Sweden, Shias make up between 20 and 40% of the Muslim population. So it's a much higher proportion of Shias in Sweden than there are in any other European countries, in fact even in the many other countries around the world. And indeed, there's some emerging literature that suggests that because of this large demographic of Shias, they have a much bigger voice within Sweden than they do in other European countries. Norway and Denmark, relatively small Shia communities, but they're very ethnically diverse, much more so than in the UK. And there are some studies that have been done that talk about the emergence of a Norwegian or a Danish Shiaism, similar to what I was talking about, the emergence of a British Shiaism, but across many more ethnicities. Also, Sweden, Denmark and Norway have transnational links to the Shia networks in the UK. And the Middle East. I had one participant who said, "What rains in London sprinkles in Oslo," to sort of suggest that there are these movements and communications between these countries. So to study Shiism in one place doesn't make sense. And then Belgium. Belgium is not an obvious example for studying Shia Muslims, mostly because something of like 90 to 95% of the population there are Sunni. However, it does have one of the largest Muslim communities in Europe, and there is a growing number of Shia converts from Sunnism, so often of Moroccan backgrounds, who are converting to Shiism in Belgium, or reverting, or whatever you want to call it. But and this is starting to become quite, or certainly growing in pace. In fact, the wife of a famous Belgian footballer recently converted to Shiism. So that's quite interesting. You know, in this country, which has one of the largest Muslim populations in Europe, predominantly Sunni, also the seat of the European Parliament, so therefore is quite influential in terms of how Europe sees itself. You have this sort of new and emerging sense of Shiism and Shia identity, which is very different to the Shiism, say, in Northern Europe or Scandinavia, which comes from the countries who are people who are born Shia and have a cultural association. You actually have these North African Sunnis who are converting to Shiism. So what does that mean in terms of what it means to be Shia in Belgium? Yeah, so the question that I'm trying to answer now is, do we have an emergence of what we could call a European Shiism? Are Shias in different countries in Europe working together to foster a common sense of what it means to be Shia? Along, say, the lines of the campaigns that I've witnessed here in the UK and London, such as the Imam Hussein blood donation, such as the Who is Hussein campaign, around these themes of justice, equality, standing up to oppression. At the moment, I don't know. My sense is that there is potentially that is happening, but I need to find the data to back that up. So this is the rise of a Shia Muslim consciousness. That is an academic reference to a work by Nasser Mir, who wrote about a Muslim consciousness in the UK. I would argue a Sunni Muslim consciousness, because he doesn't at all talk about the difference between Sunni and Shia. But as I said, this sense of Shiism as an emancipatory minority identity, which also reflects arguably the globalization of liberal discourses such as justice, equality, human rights, which of course, when you're talking about the European context, it makes sense that people who are born and brought up here would start to internalize these, you could say, Western narratives of what it means to be good, what it means to be just, what it means to be equal, in a way that, say, their parents' generation or their grandparents' generation, who were living in Iraq or Iran or Afghanistan, wouldn't understand. So, this is discussion points. The idea, I was hoping, it would be to open the floor and to get some input from people in terms of comments, feedback, ideas for future research. So these are some of the questions that are sort of keeping me up at night, as it were. What does it mean to be Shia in the modern age? Is the meaning and content of Shia identity different in the West than in the Islamic world, which is partly what I'm trying to suggest, but of course I'm I'm open to that being also wrong. Or what is the nature of the relationship between European Shiaism and European Islam? Do Western-born Shias relate to their Shia identity differently than their parents' generation? If so, how and why? What practical measures can be taken to increase the visibility and representation of Shia Muslims in Europe? Now, I'm aware that I'm technically not an anthropologist. I did my PhD in politics, but I did a lot of anthropology methods and theory, and there's this sort of this trope in anthropology that says everything anthropology ends with "it's complicated." So with your allowance, I would like to say, well, the answer to these are probably complicated, but I would like to open the floor, and I would like to have a discussion about these issues. So thank you for your time. And